Good afternoon, friends. Welcome back to my channel. Now I know, where have I been? I'm supposed to be posting every week, but it's now been 3 weeks since my last video. I'm so sorry, you guys. So after my first post, I was working on my website, trying to optimize it and make it faster, and I totally messed it up. I don't know what I did, but it just would not let me log back in to fix anything. So I spent the next 2 weeks trying to figure out how to fix it, and so finally I just gave up and deleted it and started the whole thing over. So luckily my site is now back up and running, but I've got some catching up to do. I know we were doing the tropical plants, but spooky season, Halloween is one of my favorite holidays, so I've got to make some spooky content for you guys. Speaking of setbacks, I was going to try and record this video on my boyfriend's actual camera, but of course there was no space, so it totally did not record me doing the actual sketch. So I'm really sorry you guys don't get to see that, but I hope you still enjoy my video. So what you see me doing here is I'm putting down some colors that I think I'm going to use, and I did a watered down blue color over it just to see if the colors will still show through, and they do. So what I'm going to start with is yellow, so that I can add all of the highlights into this graveyard. So right now I'm filling in the moon. So let's talk about this graveyard. That was just the one thing that I could think of to start off spooky season. I don't know why, but I did. So I have like a little spiky fence going on in the background, some tombstones, and some ghosts floating around in there. So I'm taking this yellow color and highlighting where the light of the moon is hitting the tombstones and on top of some hills that I did there, because I didn't want it to just be flat. I don't know why, but I was like inspired by Casper. I don't know if you guys know what I'm talking about, but when I was little, I had a VHS tape of Casper the Friendly Ghost, and that was like literally the only Casper movie, any type of Casper related thing that I watched when I was little, and I still remember it. Well, kind of. I don't really remember what happened in it, and I don't remember the name of it, but I do remember watching it. So that's what I was thinking of when I drew this spooky graveyard. Alright, so this color that you see me mixing is going to eventually be the green that I use on the grassy part of the graveyard. So when I use it, I'm going to water it down a lot so that I can wash it over the highlights and shadows that I'm going to do. So this is like a really dark, like bluish green color. So I mixed in some red in there and some yellow to get it to the green that I want. Okay, so next I'm using purple to add in the shadows, and the reason I'm using purple is because I want it to be like a nighttime scene. Obviously, you don't go to the graveyard in the daytime, right? At least not in spooky season. So the purple is going to give it that like cool nighttime feel. So I'm adding this shadow purple around the tombstones and into the parts of the hills where the hill is supposed to go down. Hopefully that makes sense. Because like I said, we always want to add highlights and shadows to our painting to give it a little bit more depth and make it a little more interesting. And I'm not even done yet, but I hope you guys can see how adding highlights and shadows really brings the painting to life. I mean, I really only have 2 colors on here and the rest is blank space, and you can already tell that it's a hilly graveyard. So that's why it's so important to add those elements into your painting. Okay, and we can't forget about our clouds up in the sky. I wanted to do this before I get any other of the foreground colors on there. So I'm using that same exact purple to do the shadows in my clouds, and I'm also going to take that yellow to highlight the clouds so that it's not just flat white clouds, because clouds never look all flat and white. They're always reflecting some kind of light, and they have shadows. That's what makes them look all round and fluffy. Okay, so for my sky color, I mixed some purple into this dark blue that I had. And what you're gonna see me do is make it really watery. And so it comes out kind of like a wash. So if you see me painting, it almost looks like a watercolor. And that's because I wet my paintbrush and I let some of that water mix into that color that I'm using. Because I didn't want to paint over the yellow and the purple that I just put down, but I wanted it to wash over it so that it could have that, nighttime effect. Because if I just left the yellow as bright as it is, it would feel kind of out of place. It wouldn't really match. So in order to get that nighttime spooky feel, I had to do the wash of blue over those colors. Okay, so now I'm going to use that same dark bluish green color that I used to mix the grass color, but I'm trying to darken it up as much as I possibly can because I ran out of black paint. So I want to make a gray for the tombstones. So I'm using that color because it's the darkest that I have. I mixed some dark blue in there and some red to get it as close to gray as possible. So then when I use it on the tombstones, it'll look great because I'm also gonna water it down for the tombstones. I don't want them to be like super, super dark. But as you can see, that blue is showing up, but I've darkened it just enough to where it looks gray. And one thing to notice also is I'm being mindful of how I apply the paint to the tombstones because, dimension is everywhere. And I want the tombstones to be dimensional as well because, in the beginning, I added those highlights, so I don't want to throw off the illusion. So what I did is the very first brush strokes are going to be the ones with the most color. So I started painting the tombstone where I wanted my darker shadows to be at. So then as I kept painting and it would water down with my paintbrush into the other areas. So I hope that makes sense. I started painting with the most color on the areas where I wanted shadows to be on my tombstones. So then when it waters out, the color will spread. Okay, and now we're getting into the grass. So as you can see on my palette, it looked super, super dark. But because I'm making it super watery, then all of the green color is showing through. So I wanted it to be kind of like greenish blue, so it could be like nighttime hazy type of feel. And I'm making sure to avoid the tombstones because I want my tombstones to be gray. I don't want them to be green or blue because they're not part of the grass. The highlights and the shadows is part of the grass, so I want that wash to go over those colors. But the tombstones are gray tombstones and they should stay that way. So when you use your acrylic paint like this, you kind of got to work it. Obviously it's super watered down, so the coverage is not going to be as well as if you just used straight acrylic. So I'm going over some spots where I feel like it's too thin, because if you don't do that, it could end up looking streaky and you'll see brushstrokes, but not in a good way. In my last post, I wanted brushstrokes to be on my background, but in this case, I don't want the brushstrokes to show because it'll just look bad. Alright, so once I got the base color for my grass the way that I wanted it, I'm going to go back in with more paint and I'm going to darken up the areas where I want to make a clear distinction between the hills. So even though I put lights and shadows on the hills, that gives it some distinction, but if you could see before, the background and the foreground was kind of blending into each other, so that depth wasn't really there. So I'm making the hills in the background darker than the hills in the foreground, because you want to be able to tell where one hill starts and the other hill ends. And we're going to take advantage of the fact that our paint is so watery because you can build up to exactly how much color you want. All right, and now I'm touching up my tombstones because when I did that grass color, of course, you know, some of it got on the tombstones. And you know what? The gray was a little too light. It was getting washed out by all the other colors in the painting. So darkening them up helped bring them out a lot. I mean, after all, it is a graveyard. You got to see the gravestones, right? And one thing I did forget to mention, you guys, is that you always want to wait until your paint dries between the layers. So I waited for it to dry after I did the highlights and the shadows, and then I did the sky color and the tombstones. Waited for that to dry before I did the grassy color, because if you don't wait for it to dry, then everything's going to get all mixed up and your whole painting's going to be muddy and it's not going to look good. So right now I'm obviously just using some white to fill in the ghosts, and the good thing about the white that I have is that it's actually not very opaque, so you do have to build up the layers if I wanted it to be a solid white. But since they're ghosts, I actually don't want it to be a solid white. I like the way that they came out. And I'm going to use that same white to fill in those clouds. So remember how I did the highlights and the shadows before? So now is when I'm going to use the white to actually bring out those clouds. So I mentioned in my last video about being careful when you're painting on paper, because if you make it too watery, it'll bubble up. And I don't know if you guys can tell, but if you look at the bottom right corner of my paper, you see how it's all curved up like that? That's what happens when you use too much water with your paint. In my case, it was kind of unavoidable because I wanted the colors to be watery and washed out. So I knew that that was going to happen, but that's another reason why it's important to wait for your layers to dry before you add more paint. And now I'm using that same gray that I used for the tombstones to give the ghosts some cute little faces. And for the final touches, I'm using a Sharpie marker to fill in some of the details. So that fence that I drew in the background, I felt like if I tried to do it with paint, it just wouldn't go well. I don't know, I just knew that the lines were not going to come out as crisp and straight as I wanted them. So I'm using a fine tip Sharpie. And just so you know, because I'm using it over paint, think of it as like kind of chalky. So the chalkiness got on that Sharpie and it made it not work as well as it should. Like after a couple of brush strokes, it would fade out. So I was using it on my paper towel next to me to get the chalkiness off and then go back on the paint, but it just wasn't working out, so I switched to a regular Sharpie. And I'm also gonna put some details on the hills and the gravestones, outline the gravestones and the ghosts so that all my details pop out. Alright guys, and with that, we are done. This is my spooky graveyard. What do you guys think? I think it looks so cute. Honestly, while I was painting it, I thought it wasn't going to be that good, but it turned out a lot better than I thought. And that's the whole point of this channel, right? Just jumping into it, doing something that you love and that you like, and seeing how it turns out. Thank you so much for watching my video. And again, I'm sorry for making you guys wait, but I'm gonna really try to not do that again. But if you like my video, please make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you want to see more of my artwork. You can follow me on Instagram and follow my blog at lennylovesart.com. Have a wonderful day.